Center, I'm responsible for special programs. And on behalf of the Merit Center, I want to welcome you all, and especially our guest, Gabe, and to thank him for coming back to talk with us all. For those of you who don't know Gabe, he's the author of Wake Up to Politics, a daily political newsletter, which has approximately 50,000 subscribers. He's also the host of Wake Up to Politics podcast, a partnership with the St. Louis Public Radio, and he's been profiled in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other news outlets. He graduated from John Burroughs School in May, and he's currently attending Georgetown University. And I'm not sure that there's a more appropriate place than Washington, D.C. for Gabe to be in at this very moment. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to hearing your reflections and observations.
Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Can everyone see that? All good? Okay, so I just put together kind of a look at a bit of, first of all, to look at kind of the results that we've gotten so far. Obviously, the election took place exactly a week ago. We still don't have all the results in, but we do have a pretty clear picture of the results in most races, and there's a few more coming in. And then so I thought we'd just kind of take a look at what we know, and then a few different kind of takeaways from kind of the results that we have, and as the two parties kind of reflect and look at what took place last week and what will be happening in the 4 years ahead. And then so that's kind of what I'll be hoping to do. And then afterwards, I'm happy to take any questions about the election, the results, about politics in general. There we go. So to start off, obviously with the biggest race that was on the ballot was the presidency. As I'm sure most of you heard, Joe Biden has been declared the president-elect by basically every media organization. The president has yet to concede, but it is pretty clear at this point, Joe Biden has passed the 270 electoral votes that he needs to win the presidency. At this point, as you can see, there are 3 states that have been called by all organizations that he's flipped: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which kind of made up the so-called blue wall that fell to Donald Trump in 2016, but Joe Biden was able to pick back up. The Associated Press and Fox News have called Arizona, which has 11 electoral votes for Biden. So that would bring him, as you can see here, from 279 to 290. And then he's also leading in Georgia, which has 16 electoral votes, which means it's likely that he'll probably end up at 306 electoral votes, which is the same number that President Trump won in 2016, with the caveat that it is fairly close in Arizona. Biden's currently winning by about 5,000 votes, and it has been dropping. So there's a bit of uncertainty there, that there are still some ballots left to be counted, and it's possible that the president could take the edge there, although Biden is still leading, and that there also is going to be a recount in Georgia, but Biden's leading by about 12,000 votes, and it's pretty unlikely. Generally, there's only about a couple hundred votes that change in a recount. I believe the average over the past 15 years is 282 over the statewide recounts that have been held in the past 15 years. So Biden's leading by about 12,000 votes. It's pretty unlikely that that'll change, but it is not declared yet. And then the president's leading both in North Carolina and Alaska, the other 2 states left to be called. Alaska is just very slow to count ballots. We're going to see a few more results today because they wait like a week before they even start counting a lot of their ballots. And then North Carolina, there's still a few more ballots left to be accepted because they have a kind of longer deadline to accept mail-in ballots. But the president's leading pretty comfortably in both of those states. And then moving on to the Senate, also kind of a bit of a hazy picture right now. So far, Republicans picked up 1 seat in Alabama, where you may remember Doug Jones won the special election in 2017, beating Roy Moore. So he lost re-election, and the Republicans picked that seat up. Democrats picked up 2 seats, defeating Cory Gardner in Colorado and defeating Martha McSally in Arizona. And so right now, as you can see, the Senate's at 48-48. That'll probably get up to 50-48 because Republicans are leading in, again, Alaska and North Carolina, both of which haven't been called, which leads to the possibility that it could end as a 50-50 tie because there's 2 races in Georgia that are going to go to a runoff, meaning that the state law requires a candidate to get above 50%. If no candidate does that on election day, it goes to a runoff. Both of those will be held on January 5th. it's hard to know what exactly will happen there. Obviously, like I said, Vice President Biden is leading in Georgia, so it appears that he's flipped that state. So, and he's the first Democrat since Clinton to win Georgia. So it's a state that's trending blue. It's certainly, though, an uphill battle for Democrats to win either of those Senate seats. So if Republicans win both, you'll probably have a 52-48 Senate. If Democrats do manage to win both, it would be tied 50-50, in which case Vice President-elect Kamala Harris would break the tie. It's also very possible Raphael Warnock could win, who's the Democrat, could win one of the races, while David Perdue wins the regular election, which would lead to a 51-49 Senate. So that's what we're looking at right now, with still kind of an unclear picture, still more to come in. And then in the House, we also don't have all the races called. You can see in the races that have been called, Democrats are just below the 218 threshold that puts them over the top for the majority. They are certainly expected to win the majority, but as you can see, right now Republicans have gained 5 seats, and that's expected to grow somewhat. And that was kind of a big shock on election night. There was a lot of Democrats who were expecting not only to keep the majority, which they will do, but to grow it by 10 or 15 seats. And even a lot of Republicans were expecting to lose seats. And whereas it's the Democrats that are going to be seeing their majority shrinking. So far, they've only flipped 1 seat that isn't due to redistricting. So that was a pretty kind of disappointing night for House Democrats, even though they will retain control of the chamber. But they really kind of across the board in a lot of battleground districts that they were pretty confident about and ended up losing. And then I also wanted to touch on briefly, obviously there were a few races in Missouri, since I know most of you are in St. Louis. You saw Governor Mike Parson was elected for his first kind of full term. He was expected to win, but as you can see here, by a 17-point margin, was well larger than a lot of the polls had projected. At the very least, kind of a closer race between him and Nicole Galloway, who is the state auditor. And it was kind of one of the few kind of gubernatorial races across the country that was seen as potentially competitive. And as you can see, it ended up in something of a blowout for Governor Parson. On the congressional level as well, one of the most closely watched races in the country was right in the St. Louis suburbs in the 2nd district, which some of you may have voted in. And Congresswoman Ann Wagner faced State Senator Jill Shoup. And that was expected to be a pretty close race. There was a lot of Democrats poured a lot of money and resources into that race as one of those seats, like I mentioned before, that they thought they'd be able to pick up. That one of those suburban districts we've seen across the country kind of trending blue, trending against President Trump. And you've seen Republicans having a harder time there. But as it turns out, Wagner's looking like she's going to win by even more than she did in 2018. So again, that was a bit of a surprise for Democrats, who thought they'd be able to retake that district, which has been a Republican stronghold for a long time, but just because of its suburban makeup, kind of similar to a lot of the districts that have trended Democratic across the country, they thought they had a shot there, and it slipped away by a pretty fair-sized margin. I also wanted to highlight in my home district, Cori Bush won the first congressional race. A lot of you probably remember she won the primary back in August, defeating Lacey Clay, who's held the seat for decades, and his father held it for decades before him. She'll be Missouri's first African-American female member of Congress. And that was really kind of an upset victory back in August that she won. It was not a surprise that she won. It's a heavily Democratic district, so not a surprise that she won the general election in November, or general election last week. But she's certainly expected to kind of shake things up in Washington as kind of member of the squad, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, some of the most progressive members of the House Democratic Caucus, a lot of whom, themselves defeated incumbents in the primaries like AOC did and like Cori Bush has just done. So she is expected to be someone to watch, just as the Democrats are really kind of have a lot of internal battles that they're fighting over their agenda and over the future of the party. She's going to be an interesting person there. And then also there were 2 statewide ballot measures, one that would have installed some term limits for certain statewide elected officials that failed narrowly, and then another amendment that overturns parts of the Clean Missouri Amendment that was passed 2 years ago, and that narrowly was approved. And that'll make some changes to the redistricting process that was put in place by Clean Missouri. That'll now be done by redistricting commission as by a bipartisan commission as opposed to a nonpartisan demographer, which is how the amendment from 2 years ago had it. So I wanted to now address a few takeaways from those results. That's pretty much kind of an overview of what we know. So now I kind of will want to look into what we can take away from that. So to me, so these are kind of, to me, what are kind of the biggest things to note about the results. The first being that the polls failed kind of across the board in a pretty big way. A lot of the polls that we have been looking at all throughout the election really missed in a big way. And so you can see here in all 50 states on the presidential level, and then in some of the top Senate battlegrounds, you can see the amount by which polls underestimated Republicans, the final polling average versus the results. This is as of a few days ago, so this isn't exactly up to date, but the story that it shows is roughly true, that across the board, polls underestimated Republican support. And that was something we saw in 2016 as well. A lot of pollsters were pretty confident that they had kind of fixed that problem by waiting for education, by waiting for voters that without college degrees to try to make up for the support that the president has among those voters who might not be answering the polls. They thought that would fix the issue, and you can see it clearly didn't. That pollsters just have a really big issue in terms of modeling Republican turnout, and you see it in a lot of the presidential battlegrounds, even in states that Joe Biden did end up winning. But like you take Wisconsin, for example, which he did win, but there were polls just before election day that showed him winning by 15 points. Whereas just like Trump won in 2016, it's going to be by a razor thin margin. And then in the Senate, there were a lot of Democrats who not only thought they would expand the majority in the House, but there was a lot of Democrats, and not just Democrats, there was a lot of pollsters, a lot of nonpartisan analysts that were expecting a lot of gains for Senate Democrats, that they'd be able to pick up the majority. Whereas you see, for example, in Maine was probably one of the bigger surprises of the night. Susan Collins was facing re-election. She did not lead a single poll the entire election cycle against Sarah Gideon, who's the Democratic nominee, and she won re-election on Tuesday night. And you can see here, her support was underestimated by about 10 points, which is a pretty big miss for pollsters. And it also goes to show, I think something that is going to be important to watch is that it's not just Trump that the pollsters are underestimating. I think a lot of people talk about the possibility that there's a shy Trump voters out there. I don't know if any of you have heard that term. There's kind of the idea that there's a lot of pollsters talk about sometimes called social desirability bias, that voters are picking up the phone when pollsters are calling and just lying to them because there's one candidate or the other that's seen as being more socially desirable. And so there's a lot of people that thought that might be why President Trump supporters underestimated, because of people who secretly support the president but were claiming to vote for Biden. But that just doesn't really answer for why Susan Collins, Tom Tillis, so many Republican senators just outperform their polls by a huge margin. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot of reckoning within the polling industry, just as a lot of pollsters are going to be forced to answer for how they so badly missed 2 elections in a row, just in a pretty big way, and they thought they had solved the issue, and just clearly that there remains a lot of kinks in how pollsters are trying to model how people are voting, and then also who is voting as they try to model for turnout and for the makeup of the electorate. And they just clearly, there seems to be some issues, and that's true for the public polling that you can see here, and also for internal polling. A lot of Democratic and Republican campaigns had internal polling that showed really different results than they got. So you kind of see just across the industry, just kind of a lot of problems for pollsters. The next thing that I want to note is another kind of big takeaway from the results on Tuesday are just the big changes that we saw kind of in political demography. You see kind of, so this is from the New York Times. This shows different neighborhoods that are majority of certain demographics, and then show how they were changed, how their vote share changed from 2016 to 2020. The first thing to highlight is right there at the bottom. You see huge gains that the president made among majority Hispanic areas, and then particularly Cuban areas. And you saw that in Florida, where the president won Florida pretty handily, even though the polls had shown it to be a close race. And then specifically in Miami-Dade County, which has a large Cuban population, you saw the president running well ahead of his margins in 2016, picking up a lot of Cuban support, and then also nationwide picking up a lot of Hispanic support, just showing kind of those shifting demographics. You also saw Black voters while Joe Biden did increase his voter turnout among Black voters from Hillary Clinton, there was slight gains made, as you can see, +2 for the president among Black voters. So you can, but then on the other end, you see with white voters, specifically, this makes exceptions for education, so it's harder to get a kind of a full picture. But we did see in general in most states movement towards Vice President Biden among white voters. So you can see kind of the racial polarization of our politics that have been kind of firmly in place for a few decades now, where white voters kind of voted heavily Republican and minority voters voted heavily Democratic. That's not completely changing, but it is starting to shift, and we saw that in big ways on Tuesday night. The question whether that remains, whether Black and Hispanic voters that moved over to the Republican side and white voters that moved over to the Democratic side, whether that stays in place as President Trump moves out of the spotlight and Vice President Biden moves into it over the next 4 years. That's kind of an open question, but it's certainly very interesting to watch. And it was a very interesting coalition that the president cobbled together. He got the highest share of non-white voters for any Republican presidential candidate since 1960. And you also saw down ballot, kind of a similar story where Republicans did better among those voters. You saw in the House a record number of Republican women win House seats, so a bit of a change too to gender dynamics. And so those are just some interesting dynamics that we saw on Tuesday that are going to be kind of, I think, very determinative of politics over the next 4 years as demographic politics are changing. One other piece that I would note of this is you can see the numbers for rural and urban areas. And I do think increasingly we're seeing in politics that even as racial politics become slightly less polarized, you see geographic politics becoming even more polarized, where you see urban areas, even though you see here them moving towards the president, still you see them kind of vary in huge numbers backing Democrats, whereas rural areas are in huge numbers backing Republicans. And even more than someone's race or gender, it's becoming clear that where they live is kind of one of the, if not the most, one of the most determinative factors when we're trying to predict how they're going to vote, just because even no matter what people's race or skin color is, where they live, just again and again, you see that in huge numbers, people grouping together by where they live and how they vote. The other thing I want to highlight is about fundraising. So you can see here, this is a tweet of mine from the day after Election Day. So again, the numbers in terms of the margins here have changed a little bit, but again, the broad story remains true about a week later. These are 5 Senate Democratic candidates, all of them in fairly reddish states, with the exception of Sarah Gideon from Maine, but all of whom raised record sums of money in 2020. You saw huge grassroots enthusiasm behind all of these candidates. And you can see here Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, who's running against Lindsey Graham, raised $108 million. He broke the record for the most money ever raised for a Senate candidate in a single quarter, followed closely behind by Amy McGrath, who was challenging Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, raised $88 million, also a huge sum for a Senate campaign. And then both of them lost by double digits. And frankly, the person who's third in that kind of record is Beto O'Rourke from 2018, who also raised a huge sum of money running against Ted Cruz, also came up short by quite a fair margin. So I think in terms of another one of these takeaways of ways that politics is just going to be reoriented in the next few years, I think you're going to see a lot of political strategists really questioning the power of money in politics. And I have up here the idea that money doesn't equal votes, which I think is something that most of us broadly knew to be true already, but just the fact that there can be so little correlation between candidates who are generating such enthusiasm and such dollar amounts, but that it's just not translating into actual electoral support is I think a pretty interesting takeaway that we saw kind of across the map on Tuesday night, where you saw these Democrats having invested huge sums of money in a lot of these candidates. And in a lot of those cases, that was money coming in from across the country, which is all well and good, but in those actual states where they were running, the Democrats just couldn't get across the finish line. And in a lot of these cases, it wasn't even close. And so these Democrats, they just weren't able, as many ads as they were running, as many leaflets as they were sending out, as many, as much resources were being poured into the race. It just didn't move the needle. And if anything, there's some evidence to suggest that it hurt them, that the more national attention that gets poured into these races, the more they get nationalized, the more fired up that Republican-based voters were getting, and the more kind of enthusiasm Republicans were getting to kind of counterbalance the Democratic enthusiasm from kind of places outside the state. And so I think that's just going to be speaking to a change that candidates on both sides of the aisle will be thinking about in terms of their strategy, as you see more and more evidence that this kind of national money just doesn't help and probably even hurts somewhat. The other thing that I want to highlight is turnout. And we saw in 2020, there's still millions of votes left to be counted in California, votes left to be counted in New York. So we don't have the full picture yet, but this is the Washington Post projection that we will reach 66.5% turnout, which is huge. And as you can see here, that's the most since 1908. So that's a huge number of voters that turned out in this election. And that was something a lot of people had expected, but it was always kind of unclear because obviously with the coronavirus pandemic, it was uncertain if people would be able to vote in as large numbers as we are seeing enthusiasm in polling. And in the end, through a combination of in-person voting and a record number of people voting by mail and voting early, we did see this record turnout, which is just pretty extraordinary to watch. But the thing that I think is important to highlight is there were a lot of analysts that saw that in the polling, that there would be high turnout and assumed that high turnout would equal a lot of votes for Democrats, and that there are a lot of Democrats who assume that high turnout elections are kind of naturally good for them. But I think the thing that I want to point out that, despite the fact that Vice President Biden did win on Tuesday night, I think all of these takeaways, about the polling, about the money, about the turnout being so high, and yet their results being so poor, just point to a pretty disappointing night for a lot of down ballot Democrats. Is I think one of the big stories of the night, because whereas Vice President Biden's victory was pretty expected, this came as a shock to a lot of people in the political world. You see here the House makeup, the kind of what the House will be looking like next year, and you see that there were races that almost all of the battleground races, or many of them at least, went to Republicans. Even some races that were seen as kind of safer Democratic seats ended up going to Republicans. And that just reflects, like I was saying, the fact that even though turnout was at record levels, it didn't just surge for Democrats, it surged for Republicans too. And you saw that on the presidential level, where the president really outperformed his polls in Florida, in Iowa, in states like that, in Texas and Ohio. And then you saw that on the congressional level, and then also state legislatures. The Democrats were really targeting a lot of state legislative chambers. They were hoping to flip them because, as many of you may know, this year, the decennial census was conducted this year, which means the state legislators that were elected this year will be drawing the redistricting maps for the next 10 years and deciding how the congressional districts are drawn for the next decade. And so Democrats poured a lot of resources, particularly into Texas was a big one, and a lot of other states, to try to flip those state legislative chambers. They didn't flip a single one. In fact, the only state legislative chambers that flipped in the country were in New Hampshire, and that was towards Republicans. So you just see kind of, I think, all of those takeaways that I laid out, where you do see kind of pretty stark narratives from Tuesday night's results. Pretty much all of them point in the Republican direction. But except for on the presidential level, where of course Joe Biden is the president-elect, and while his party had a pretty bad night on Tuesday, obviously the presidential race, the most important race that was on the ballot, did go in Democrats' favor. And you see President Donald Trump becoming the first president to be defeated for re-election since George H.W. Bush. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we know from the numbers, from the exit polls, from the analytics that suggest how that happened. And pretty much the story there is kind of in every one of the demographics that Hillary Clinton kind of really struggled with in 2016, that she really underperformed in, Joe Biden overperformed in. And so you see that among working class white voters, were kind of a big category of voters that Hillary Clinton pretty famously struggled in. I've highlighted here Lackawanna County in Pennsylvania is kind of seen as one of the kind of like classic districts of working class white voters. It's also Joe Biden's classic counties, excuse me. It's also Joe Biden's home county, home to Scranton, Pennsylvania, traditionally a very Democratic county, then one that Hillary Clinton won by only 3 points in 2016 after Barack Obama won by 27 points. in 2012. And there were a lot of analysts that thought that Donald Trump might even flip that county in 2020, but Joe Biden won it by 5. And so you saw that similar story play out, not just in Pennsylvania, but in the other Rust Belt states, those blue wall states that Donald Trump won in Michigan and in Wisconsin. You saw Joe Biden really doing well among working class white voters, fueling his victory. You also saw that among urban and suburban voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So far, Joe Biden's margins in Detroit and Michigan, in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, and in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania are all pretty by pretty significant numbers larger than Hillary Clinton's margin. So he really ran up the vote in urban areas. Like I said, also the suburbs have been trending towards Democrats, and you saw that in a lot of those Midwestern suburbs. The same exact story that where Hillary Clinton failed, Joe Biden succeeded and was able to bring voters in some cases back into the fold where they may have voted for Donald Trump in 2016, or to bring out voters who had just stayed home. And you saw that particularly among minority voters, where even as I said before, there's been some slight movement kind of in nationally in with some minority populations towards Republicans, but kind of in those kinds of key states where Hillary Clinton saw pretty poor turnout among minority voters, you saw Joe Biden really expand her margins there, and that was what really fueled his victory, his ability to flip Arizona and Georgia. Again, those states have not been called by every news organization, but he is leading pretty comfortably in both of them. In Georgia, he was able to, the kind of classic question is whether Democrats can get 30%, whether they can get the African American electorate up to be 30% of the electorate in Georgia, which Joe Biden did exceed. And so you saw that. And then in Arizona, you saw him working up his numbers among Hispanics. You also saw in Florida and Arizona, Joe Biden making gains among seniors was also a key area. And then independent voters, you saw in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost independents nationally, and she lost independents in all of those key states that I'm talking about. Joe Biden won them. And so that was just very crucial to his victory, whereas Donald Trump was able to bring over independents in pretty much every battleground state. You saw in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, Joe Biden won independent voters. And then the other thing I want to highlight is third parties, whereas we saw in 2016, Donald Trump benefited pretty significantly from Jill Stein and Gary Johnson being on the ballot, and in some cases defecting voters who would have voted for Hillary Clinton voting for them. But in 2016, most of the third party support was to Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian nominee. And a lot of that is seen as support that would have gone to Donald Trump. And just like in 2016, in a lot of cases, the number of votes that Jorgensen got are larger than the margins that Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania were won by. And you see that instead of hurting the Democrat, this time hurt the Republican. So those are some of the kind of the key areas where even though, like I said, down ballot, Democrats weren't necessarily able to engineer all of those factors, but Joe Biden was able to, and he's going to end up, if he wins the states he's leading in, with 306 electoral votes, which is not a landslide. Barack Obama's 2 electoral college victories were with 365 votes and 332. And you've seen, presidents like Ronald Reagan get, 400 electoral, excess of 400, 500 electoral votes. And so, it's not a huge landslide, but it is a comfortable electoral college victory. You only need 270. So to get up to 306 is a pretty comfortable margin. And so that was certainly a success for Joe Biden there. And I do think there's a case to be made if you look at these kind of groups that I've highlighted, that it's possible that was something that Joe Biden alone could have done. Obviously, we can't go back and run this election with anyone else as the Democratic nominee, so we can't say with certainty. But pretty much these groups are the exact ones that Joe Biden had always been saying from the beginning of the primary, that he alone could kind of bring back into the Democratic fold, that he kind of had the connections, in places like Scranton, Pennsylvania, with working class white voters, that he had the relationship with Black voters across the country, that he could run above Hillary Clinton's margins, and he did it. And so, we can't say for sure whether he's the only Democrat that might have been able to achieve that, but there's no question that Joe Biden did exactly kind of what Democrats had nominated him for, exactly what he had said he'd be able to do. With kind of the theory of the case for the Biden nomination was always about bringing over these groups, And it happened, and it happened even while a lot of Democrats struggled down ballot. So you do see that as a fairly resounding success for Vice President Biden. So before I take some questions here, I wanted to then talk a little bit about what's next. That's obviously kind of one of the bigger questions. You see here Joe Biden with Mitch McConnell. The story of the next 4 years is going to be really one of divided government, we expect, if Democrats are not able to pick up the 2 Senate seats in Georgia, that then you're going to see really big changes to what Democrats were expecting, where they thought they'd be able to enact a pretty sweeping agenda when it comes to climate change, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to the economy, on a whole, long list of issues. Democrats thought they might have complete control, whereas now it's going to really come down to this relationship you see here between Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell. What is Biden able to get through a Republican Senate? What nominees is he able to get through? When you start seeing in a few weeks him beginning to unveil his cabinet, and you see that process about to start, and you'll see he's going to be having to please Mitch McConnell, who is likely to remain the Senate Majority Leader, and then he's also going to have to please the left flank of his own party. And you've already seen some fissures emerging among Democrats after they stayed pretty united through the election, but now obviously there's pretty competing visions in the Democratic Party about what direction President-elect Biden should take, about what issues he should prioritize, about who ends up in the cabinet. You see people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. It's been reported both of them want cabinet positions. It's hard to know if Vice President Biden is going to give those appointments to them. It's really hard to see them being able to be confirmed by a Republican Senate. So that certainly changes the dynamic. And then also, obviously, and I'm happy to kind of take more questions about this, we see even as President-elect Biden is beginning to meet with his advisors and plan for his agenda and for his cabinet, that process has started somewhat informally, but because it technically only starts when the federal government designates him the president-elect. And as many of you probably know, the Trump administration has not yet done that, even though it's pretty abundantly clear that President-elect Biden is the president-elect, that he's won pretty comfortably and in the states that he needs to. President Trump has not conceded the election. He's continuing to contest them in a bunch of states. And the federal government is not acknowledging that Joe Biden is the president-elect, which, it does not stop him from continuing to put together a cabinet and to do a lot of the things that a presidential transition composes of, but it does stop a lot of funds from going his way that are traditionally designated to presidential transition teams. It does stop him from getting the access that a transition team needs from the outgoing government agencies. It stops him from getting full intelligence briefings as president-elect. So there are pretty sizable consequences to, the General Services Administration is the agency that makes that determination, that ascertains when a candidate has become the president-elect. In 2008 and in 2016, even though, like now, the outgoing president was a different party than the incoming one. That happened the next morning after the election. And here we are a week later, and 3 or 4 days after media organizations have made the determination that it's pretty clear Joe Biden is the president-elect. Still, the General Services Administration hasn't done so, and we don't know when that will happen. And that will, at the very least, provide some hurdles for his transition and could hobble him as he begins to kind of form his government after defeating Donald Trump last week. So that's kind of the thoughts that I wanted to share, some of the takeaways that I think are kind of crucial from the results. And at this point, I'll stop sharing. And I'm happy to take any questions if people want to ask them.
John Reichman has a question, Gabe. Gabe, do you think that the down ballot Dem lack of success is due to votes against Trump rather than for Joe? And John, if you wanted to unmute yourself, you could communicate too.
I can go ahead and answer. Yeah, I mean, I think yes. I think that is definitely a dynamic that we saw. Oh, is there?
There you are.
Go ahead and complete there.
We can hear you.
Okay, so you think that some of that success that, or lack of success is due to just people who may have voted for more Republicans and obviously did vote for more down ballot Republicans, but voted against Trump rather than supporting actually Joe?
I think the answer is yes, absolutely. That the Biden campaign was able to peel off a lot of independents and Republican-leaning voters that clearly disapprove of President Trump, but that Democrats down ballot were not able to get that same support. So I think yes, that was a big dynamic. I'll say also anecdotally, your question reminded me just of kind of being here in DC the past few days. I was at the White House just a few days ago. As you know, a lot of the celebrations were taking place, and something that I noticed, and this is anecdotal, so I don't mean to suggest this is like a data-driven view of how voters voted, but it was pretty clear to me being there that those were anti-Trump celebrations, not pro-Biden. And so I think you did see that kind of across the country, that a lot of people were very motivated to vote against Donald Trump, but then when it came further down the ballot, there was just not that same energy in terms of electing Democratic senators and representatives. And I do think that did hurt down ballot Democrats, where they thought if Joe Biden was going to win a certain state or district, they'd easily win as well. And that's probably a pretty fair assumption, considering historically, or at least in the modern era, ticket splitting has been very rare. You've seen in 2016, not a single state went in different results for president and Senate. And that was just not the case this year. We saw more than ever just people ticket splitting, exactly like you're talking about, people voting to defeat Donald Trump, but then still voting for Republicans down ballot. And so that is a bit of a change from past elections, where we've seen in the past few elections less and less ticket splitting and people for the most part voting all the way for a single ticket. And this year we saw that begin to change a little bit.
Abe, this is Sheldon Inger. Is there any data available on the public's reaction to Trump's failure to acknowledge defeat and resist position of administrations?
That's a good question. I have not seen any polling yet. And to be honest, as I said before, I'd be skeptical of the polling I saw, just because I am a bit skeptical after what we saw last week of the polling industry's ability to measure voter opinion. But I haven't seen any polls that ask that question. It's a good one. I'll tell you, so far we've seen Republican leaders, for the most part, join the president in those efforts. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell yesterday, also shedding some doubt on the election results and kind of joining with Trump in saying it was not decided yet. But I haven't seen any polls suggesting.
There's an interesting comment I just saw on the news before your Zoom meeting, that Pompeo said that there will be a smooth transition to the second Trump administration.
Yeah, I just saw that as well before I got on. That I think it seemed like he was telling a joke, and he laughed as he was saying it. Kind of.
I don't think Pompeo jokes.
I don't know, but it clearly, yes. I mean, a pretty stark statement from the Secretary of State, just clearly just rejecting the results of the election, and and I saw a lot of people kind of noting, even as the State Department often plays a role in going to other countries and observing foreign elections and trying to observe foreign leaders that sometimes hang on to power, and then to see him kind of imitating some of that rhetoric, it was quite something to watch. But I saw
Harvey has a question, and then we have quite a few in the chat. So Harvey, you want to ask your question first?
Before the election, OAC was talking about running against Schumer in the Senate. And then after the election, it seems that the squad and Pelosi were getting a lot of blame for the lack of Democratic showing in the election. What's your feeling on their future?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think you're seeing a lot of conversations within the Democratic Party of, there's people on the left that say the party ran too centrist, and that was their issue in a lot of these down ballot races. Whereas you see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or whereas you see a lot of other Democrats criticizing people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for kind of taking up too much of the media spotlight with kind of issues like Medicare for all, to funding the police, issues that are kind of broadly not as popular, and that some Democrats say hurt them. I think, my general answer is that, I think it's not a one size fits all approach. that political parties generally should be taking. It's generally something that should be district by district. So the point that AOC has made is that candidates who support Medicare for all have been broadly more successful than candidates that didn't. But that kind of leaves out, adjusting for what certain people's district are. And we did see candidates who support Medicare for all in kind of conservative leaning or battleground districts who lost by considerable margins. We can't know for sure whether we could attribute that to a certain policy, but we do know that there have been a lot of progressive candidates that in primaries that progressive candidates won, such as Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, where a more progressive candidate beat a more moderate Democrat. They then went on to lose pretty handily. And so I think that does suggest some readjustment that Democrats need to do, at least on the district by district level of really kind of looking at the analytics of what a particular district is like, and an approach that works in New York's 14th district, where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez kind of is able to pretty comfortably get reelected. Doesn't necessarily work in like the Omaha suburbs in Nebraska's 2nd district. And those are conversations that will continue with the party. I don't think, the squad is going anywhere. If anything, they're growing. They did see, and these weren't in battleground districts, but you saw Cory Bush in Missouri, you saw Jamal Bowman in New York. You did see some progressive candidates that were elected and are going to join the squad, and it's going to become an even larger kind of force within the Democratic Party. And you'll just see those conversations continue to play out. Obviously, Joe Biden is pretty far from them ideologically, so the party is going to be led by someone who is much more of a centrist and much more of a moderate. But he's going to have to answer to the pressure that they'll be putting on him on a lot of parts of his agenda. And then you also have Kamala Harris waiting in the wings. A lot of people expect Joe Biden won't be running in 24, and that means Kamala Harris is going to be having to think about her political future and having to please a lot of progressives over the next 4 years. So it's a lot of interesting dynamics, kind of intra-party dynamics that it's kind of unclear what playing out. There's certainly a lot of power centers that are kind of conflicting and butting up against each other.
What about Pelosi?
I mean, I think Nancy Pelosi, her position seems pretty secure, even though it was a pretty disappointing year for House Democrats. There's no one has emerged that seems likely that would challenge her. I think her speakership is pretty secure. But it's going to be by the slimmest of margins. And so, pretty much every bill that's put before the House these next 2 years, Nancy Pelosi is going to need a united Democratic caucus, which just means, spending a lot of time sitting down with people like AOC, who there have been times when spending bills have gone to the floor and AOC has voted against if she hasn't deemed them progressive enough. And Pelosi just doesn't have the room for that anymore. Whereas these past 2 years, she had a pretty comfortable majority. Now it's going to be razor thin. And I do think her speakership is pretty secure, but it's going to be a pretty tall order these next 2 years, kind of holding, this caucus together that ranges, really spans the gamut of ideology from pretty centrist Democrats to pretty progressive ones. And she really can't afford to lose people on either side for any of the bills that she's hoping to pass through in the first years of the Biden presidency.
Gabe, Stephen Puro has a question. Hello?
Did I just do that?
I don't know, but Stephen Puro had a question. I just lost all the chat. Okay. Well done. Is there a recount in Arizona? Second, did the white turnout exceed
70%?
Sorry. Yeah, the screen kind of jumped around a little bit there. 70%. And was this expected to go in Trump's direction, especially in rural and ex-urban area?
Yeah, so right now, I don't believe there is expected to be a recount in Arizona. There's supposed to be one in Georgia. Recounts are pretty rare, actually, and it's especially rare that they change the margins. And Joe Biden is leading by only a few thousand votes in Arizona, but it's likely that the final count will be the final count. We don't know when that'll be, but at this point, I haven't seen anything suggesting a recount is likely. I don't know, to be honest. I don't have the exact numbers there in terms of white turnout, and we don't really have, because votes are still left to be counted, we kind of don't have final numbers in terms of turnout, and especially because you see in kind of a lot of the bigger states, California and New York, there's still a lot of ballots left to be counted. So I don't have a final answer for you there.
Daria Reed-Riddell has a question. What could Biden have to win over more Hispanics despite Trump calling them criminals and rapists?
I think this actually brings up an interesting point, which you quote President Trump's announcement from 2016 when he did label some Hispanic immigrants as criminals and rapists. But what has been really interesting to watch over the 2020 campaign is how President Trump's rhetoric really did change around immigration. Whereas that was kind of a centerpiece of his 2016 campaign, it was almost nowhere in his 2020 campaign, as you saw Republicans really work hard to bring over Hispanics, and really he did tamp down kind of that rhetoric that you're referring to. So I think that was a big piece of how Trump was able to bring over a lot of Hispanic voters was you give those quotes, and that's absolutely are things that he said, but he did kind of move away from that as the election got closer. The other thing that I would say just in terms of Democrats winning over Hispanics, something we do know, this is partly from anecdotal reporting that a lot of reporters have done kind of in Hispanic communities. That's also from exit polling and from polls that were taken in advance of the election, which did show that Republicans would make gains among Hispanics, is that a lot of the rhetoric that the Trump campaign and Republican campaigns down ballot used against Democrats was that labeling them as socialists, and that kind of tagging Democrats as extremists and Joe Biden as a socialist, and particularly among Cuban voters, in Florida, that made a huge difference, and among Hispanic voters across the country attributed that as a big reason they voted. So I do think in terms of the messaging with Hispanic voters, a huge factor is the Republican messaging kind of tagging Democrats as socialist, as extremist. And it's interesting that if Joe Biden, of all people, was not able to kind of fight back against that rhetoric, since kind of his main way that he responded, he's like, look at me, I'm not a social, I've never been a socialist. I'm clearly a very moderate Democrat, which has been his record. But that clearly wasn't really an effective response, kind of just denying it. And I do think there's kind of the emphasis, as often comes up in election, of not just saying what you're not, but saying what you are. And I do think it is clear that kind of just response of just shutting it down and saying, that's ridiculous, I'm not a socialist, does not seem to have been the most effective way to kind of respond to those attacks that do seem to have brought over a lot of Hispanic voters to the Republican side.
Susan Kemmerden would like to know, could you see Joe Biden adding any Republicans to his cabinet to bridge the divide between parties? And have there ever been any U.S. presidents who have had advisors from the opposing party?
The answer to the second question is almost all of them. Donald Trump is the first president in recent memory not to have a lawmaker of the opposing party join their cabinet, although he does have registered Democrats such as Steve Mnuchin in his cabinet as Treasury Secretary. Barack Obama had Bob Gates as his defense secretary, Chuck Hagel as another one of his defense secretaries, Ray LaHood as transportation secretary, all Republican office holders. So yes, it's pretty common. Almost every president does appoint at least one person, the other party, to their cabinet. And I think Joe Biden will be no exception. He's obviously someone who emphasized his cross-party appeal during the campaign. You saw a number of Republicans speak at the Democratic convention, from Cindy McCain to John Kasich. And so I definitely would expect to see, whether that's someone like Kasich, someone like Jeff Flake in Arizona, that there will be at least one role somewhere that will be going to a Republican, that will be going to one of those kind of never Trump Republicans that opposed the president and that did support Biden. So I think the answer there is yes.
Nancy Price historically, how often has one party had control of both houses and the president? I think many Americans are uncomfortable with having all that power concentrated.
Yeah, I mean, the historical trend is generally almost always new presidents enter office with united control. And so it's been quite a long time since we've seen a new president not have support from both the House and the Senate when they've entered office. Then usually, I think you're right. Historically, we've seen Americans become uncomfortable with all that power being concentrated. And then almost always 2 years later in the midterms, the divided government returns. And the party that won the White House 2 years before loses control of either the House or the Senate or both. But so this is a pretty unique situation where a new president is coming in. Again, we don't know for sure, but most likely with a Republican Senate. I don't believe a Democrat has had that in more than a century. I believe George H.W. Bush did have it on the Republican side, but it's rare that a new president comes in without with divided government. Divided government itself is not uncommon because usually after the first midterm, it does happen. But this is kind of an interesting dynamic where you have voters sending a new president to the White House, but not his party to Congress. That is something we haven't seen in a while, and just it fundamentally changes. You know, we talk a lot about kind of the first 100 days of an administration, kind of the honeymoon phase, and kind of, you know, presidents generally, that's among the most productive periods of their terms are right there at the beginning. And that's partly because they usually have unified control in Washington, kind of, you know, they have the power to enact as much of their agenda as they want, and that won't be the case for Joe Biden. So that'll be a very different dynamic than we've seen.
Bill Livingston, he has asked, what with the control of the House and Senate split but close, is there much chance of the moderates of both parties forming any type of coalition? We might have answered that already. I'm not sure.
I don't find that particularly likely. I mean, like, obviously there are other countries where, you know, are run by, you know, parliamentary systems and coalition governments. I don't think they will split off and form their own party, if that's what the question is implying. But it does mean that the moderates in both parties become incredibly powerful, because, you know, if we do see, you know, let's say it's a 51-49 Senate, then, you know, you have, you know, Democrats, you know, if Joe Biden wants to pass parts of his agenda, he cannot lose Democrats like Joe Manchin, one of the more conservative Democrats in the Senate. But on the other side of the coin, Mitch McConnell can't lose more moderate Republicans like Susan Collins, who, you know, her and Lisa Murkowski, another moderate Republican senator, you know, that's all it would take, them flipping in a 51-49 Senate to pass parts of Joe Biden's agenda. So those moderates just become the most powerful people in Washington, where kind of nothing happens without their say so. And they kind of have tremendous leverage over both parties to kind of say, you know, whatever parts of the Biden agenda they want to sign off on probably can happen. And the ones that they don't, President-elect Biden will have to negotiate with them until they're happy. And then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the same, if he wants to try to fight off parts of this agenda. And so I don't necessarily think that they'll be forming their own party, but they're going to have, you know, tons of influence. But because in both chambers of Congress, you're going to see incredibly close margins, and nothing happens without those moderates agreeing and lending their votes to any of these pieces of legislation.
And then Marcia would like to know, how can Trump be made to leave?
Well, I mean, the answer there is that, you know, on January 20th at 12:01 p.m., Donald Trump, barring a surprise of catastrophic proportions, being that, you know, because he is fighting the election results, which is well within his rights, and but barring a surprise of catastrophic proportions that would overturn, you know, leads of tens of thousands of votes that Joe Biden has, on January 20th at 12:01, he'll cease to be president. And that's how that goes. And from all the reporting we've seen, it's not expected that he'll necessarily will concede the election ever, and he may never admit that he lost, and he may always claim it was rigged. But the reporting also suggests that he will step aside on January 20th. You know, if need be, the Secret Service will lift him out, but I don't expect that to necessarily need to happen. I think he will just step aside. I don't know whether he'll, you know, I just think that is what, according to people closest to the president who've spoken to reporters, that is their expectation, that he won't concede, but he will step aside, and there's really, you know, no other mechanism. You know, you know, that is what will happen on January 20th at 12:01. Joe Biden will move into the White House, and there won't really be any options left for the president once he's exhausted the legal options that he's kind of going to be using in the next few days. But then that kind of, the road ends there.
And Nancy Price says, and Romney.
Yeah, as one of those powerful senators. I mean, I think, yes, I agree. I think he's going to be another one of those interesting senators to watch. You know, not necessarily as moderate as Collins and Murkowski, but certainly as you know, but certainly open to working with Democrats. And obviously, he voted for President Trump's conviction. He's going to be another one of those senators. He has a relationship with Joe Biden. He's already one of the few that's congratulated Joe Biden and acknowledged his victory. So certainly another one of the Republican senators that is going to be interesting to watch and how he might be working across party lines.
Alessi Jacobson says, how do you think the runoff Senate vote will go in Georgia?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, I think certainly, I think Republicans are just historically favored in Georgia. It's a red state, even though Joe Biden was able to flip it. Particularly with these runoff elections. With these runoff elections across the country, Democrats have historically done pretty poorly in getting turnout and getting enthusiasm. When you have these races that take place a few months after Election Day, and that's been true in Georgia as well historically. So I think I don't want to say my expectation, but I just think the natural starting point is one that's pretty heavily in Republican favor. And we saw in Georgia on the House level, Georgia's 6th congressional district, we saw that special election in 2017. Just like these runoffs will, got huge media attention, got huge amounts of fundraising. There were polls that showed it was close, as I expect polls will show. These runoffs will be close, polls will show. And then Republicans won it pretty easily because Democrats weren't able to get the turnout that they needed. I don't know that will necessarily happen again, but it's certainly historically it would kind of be in line with what's possible. There's 2 races. The regular election is between David Perdue and John Ossoff. Perdue is seen as the pretty clear favorite there, whereas the special election, Kelly Loeffler is probably also favored, but she's an appointed senator, so she has never been elected to office ever, and not the Senate, and faces what at least according to the polls, a stronger challenger in Reverend Warnock. And so he is seen as having a better chance than John Ossoff, the Democrat in the regular election does. But they certainly both have a shot. It's hard to know. There's going to be so much money and so much attention that it's going to be a very difficult race to predict, just because whereas you have 33 Senate races, suddenly there's just these 2 and everyone will be laser focused on them. So it's hard to know exactly how it will go. But those are some of the dynamics that I think are kind of in place before the race kind of really starts in earnest.
Joseph Goldstein has a question about, didn't Obama and Democrats in 2008 hold the Senate House?
Yeah, like I said in 2008, like I said, almost every incoming president in the modern era has held both chambers of Congress when they've been elected, including Obama, who held a huge majority in the House in 2008 and a 60-vote majority at a certain point in 2009. But then also, like I said, like has happened with most modern presidents, he lost then the House majority 2 years later in 2010. So he's another one of those examples of a president who entered with a majority in both chambers of Congress and then lost it 2 years later, as is historically been the most frequent case.
I think we have time for one more. And Carla Rosen has a question. What would be the most effective way for an out-of-state resident to have an influence in the Georgia races?
It's an interesting question because, like I said, I think there's a lot of people that are really rethinking. I mean, the most natural answer would be money, would be to donate. But like I said before, a lot of people are really rethinking the influence that out-of-state money can have in elections and whether it actually kind of creates this boomerang effect where, when you have Democrats pouring in money to a state like Georgia from, places like New York and California and other states, you see Georgians not react well to that. And then it actually kind of hurts them when Republicans are able to say, look at my opponent's raising all this money from out of state. So, outside of that, I mean, like phone banking is kind of the only other way someone could have influence. I guess like the answer is, most often races aren't decided by people out of state. They're decided by the people who actually vote in them. So I don't have a great answer for you there in terms of, it's kind of hard to say because even the ways that historically people have tried to assert influence over out-of-state races now we see, can kind of hurt their favorite candidates sometimes when they just overwhelm that state with money in a way that isn't productive. So it's an interesting question, but I think at the end of the day, the Georgia Senate races will be decided by Georgians, and that's kind of the answer there.
Well, thank you so much, Gabe. We really appreciate. Does anyone else have a question? I think we're pretty questioned out. Okay, thank you so very much. You did a great job again, and with so much information, we're going to have to digest all of this information, and we really, really appreciate you speaking with us today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, everyone, have a good afternoon.
Have a good rest of your days.
Gabe, you need to give yourself a plug.
Yeah.